The night was cold and dark, with the wind howling through the deserted streets of the small town. Snow fell heavily, covering the ground in a thick, silent white blanket. In this frozen landscape, a small German shepherd puppy, his dark fur barely visible against the snow, dragged himself forward, his eyes filled with fear. His tiny body trembled, and his fragile paws left weak imprints in the fresh snow. He was exhausted, but he couldn't stop. His name was Max, and he was on a desperate mission to find help for his mother, Roxy, who was injured somewhere in the forest. As Max struggled against the biting cold, Officer Sarah Matthews sat in her patrol car, trying to stay warm as she drove through the empty streets. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes, Sarah had spent her life helping others, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. Stopping her car to stretch her legs, Sarah heard a faint, high-pitched sound coming from the darkness. Her pulse quickened. Squinting through the falling snow, she saw something moving, something small. Then, from the shadows, a tiny figure emerged. It was Max, dragging himself toward her, his breathing ragged, his body weak. His eyes held a wild panic, and his injured paw left a trail of red against the pristine snow. Sarah immediately knelt beside the trembling pup, her heart clenching at the sight of him. He was hurt, his front paw swollen and bleeding, but what struck her most was the sheer determination in his eyes. He wasn't just seeking help for himself. He was trying to lead her somewhere. "What is it, little guy?" Sarah murmured, gently running her fingers over his matted fur. Max gazed up at her with an urgency that made her hesitate. Then he took a few steps back, looking at her expectantly, as if saying, "Come with me." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and it had nothing to do with the weather. She had seen plenty of lost or abandoned animals in her time, but something about this was different. This wasn't a simple rescue. Max was trying to save someone. Without a second thought, she decided to follow him. The snow continued to fall in thick, relentless waves, the wind cutting like a blade, but she couldn't ignore Max's silent plea. Step by step, he led her through empty streets and down narrow alleys, his movements slow but determined. The deeper they went, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Finally, Max stopped at the entrance of an abandoned alleyway. Sarah hesitated, instinct warning her that something was terribly wrong. The air here felt thick, almost suffocating. Then she saw it, a thin trail of blood staining the snow. Max turned to her, his deep brown eyes filled with desperation, then padded forward, following the trail. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed him. Her boots crunched through the snow, the only sound in the eerie silence of the night. The alley opened up into a clearing at the edge of the forest, and that's when she saw her. Lying motionless in the snow was Roxy, a full-grown German shepherd. Her fur was tangled and damp, her breathing slow and labored. Blood stained the ground around her injured leg, and though her body barely moved, her ears flicked slightly at Max's approach. The pup ran to her side, licking her face, letting out soft whimpers of distress. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She didn't know what had happened, but she knew she had to act fast. Kneeling beside the wounded dog, she reached out, speaking softly. "It's okay, girl," she whispered, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline in her veins. "I'm here to help." Max turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with something that made her chest tighten, gratitude, hope, and the unwavering trust of an animal that knew he had found the right person. Sarah held Max close to her chest, feeling the icy tremors of his small body. The snow continued to fall, and the biting wind threatened to erase even the footprints that had led them to Roxy. The adult German shepherd lay motionless, her breathing so faint Sarah had to lean in to confirm she was still alive. Max whimpered, pressing his nose against his mother's neck as if trying to wake her. "We need to hurry," Sarah muttered, more to herself than the dogs. She removed her coat and wrapped Roxy carefully, trying to shield her from the cold. Max watched every move, his dark eyes reflecting a mix of fear and hope. When Sarah lifted Roxy into her arms, the weight made her stagger. The dog was large, and the deep snow turned every step into a battle. Max trotted beside her, glancing back every few paces as if ensuring Sarah was still following. The walk back to the car felt endless. The wind howled, dragging snowflakes that blinded Sarah. She stumbled over a hidden root, nearly dropping Roxy, but Max barked, jumping forward as if to warn her. "I'm okay, buddy," she whispered, steadying herself. The puppy nudged her leg, a small gesture that filled her with resolve. When they finally reached the car, Sarah settled Roxy in the back seat, covering her with emergency blankets. Max leaped in beside his mother, curling against her to share warmth. Sarah started the engine, but the wheels spun helplessly in the snow. "Not now," she growled, slamming the steering wheel. Max lifted his head, ears perked. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting panic. "Keep them warm. Find help." She tried the radio, but static crackled back. The storm had knocked out communications. Max let out a low whine, licking Roxy's injured paw. Sarah glanced back, her eyes meeting his. "We'll make it," she promised, more to convince herself. With trembling hands, she shifted gears and inched forward, tires slipping with every turn. The road was deserted, visibility nearly zero. Sarah gripped the wheel, focusing on faint tire tracks ahead. Max climbed onto her lap, his warm body pressed to her chest. His heart raced, but he stayed still, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "You're brave, you know," she whispered, stroking his soft ears. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a faded sign. "Veterinary Hospital, 3 miles." Sarah swallowed hard. 3 miles in this storm felt like eternity. Roxy let out a muffled groan, and Max answered with a sharp bark. "Almost there," Sarah said, directing her words to the dogs more than herself. The car skidded on a sharp curve, fishtailing sideways. Sarah's heart leaped to her throat, but Max stayed steady in her lap, licking her chin as if urging, "Keep going." Gasping, she straightened the wheel, hands sweating inside her gloves. When the hospital lights finally glowed in the distance, Sarah nearly cried with relief. Max barked, recognizing the building as a beacon of hope. She parked haphazardly and rushed inside with Roxy in her arms. Max followed, stumbling in the snow but determined. The receptionist looked up, startled. "She's hurt, needs help now," Sarah shouted, laying Roxy on a nearby gurney. Max jumped beside his mother, growling at anyone who approached too quickly. A vet in a green scrubs appeared, assessing Roxy with practiced eyes. "Paw trauma, advanced hypothermia," she stated. "Take her to ER." Sarah held Max back as the team wheeled Roxy away. "She'll be okay," she promised, feeling the puppy's heartbeat against hers. He buried his nose in her neck, a soft whine escaping. Sitting on the cold floor, Sarah hugged Max. Her own body shook, but his warmth kept her grounded. Minutes later, the vet returned. "She's stable, but needs surgery. You saved her life." Sarah shook her head, looking at Max. He led me to her. The woman smiled, ruffling the puppy's head. Animals know who to trust. As they waited, Sarah slumped in a plastic chair, Max asleep in her lap. His gentle snores calmed her, but unease lingered. The storm still raged outside, and she knew the drive home would be treacherous. When the vet said Roxy needed to stay overnight, Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm staying with them." Max opened his eyes, yawning. He glanced at Sarah, then at the closed doors where his mother was. His tail wagged slowly, as if understanding they were safe, for now. Sarah held him tighter, whispering, "No one will separate you." Outside, the wind roared louder, and the hospital lights flickered. Sarah stared through the window, her reflection merging with the darkness. The storm was far from over. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sarah paced the sterile hallway, Max cradled in her arms. Roxy's surgery had taken hours, and every minute gnawed at Sarah's resolve. The vet, Dr. Ellis, had warned of complications. The infection in Roxy's paw was severe, and her body, weakened by hypothermia, struggled to fight it. Max hadn't left Sarah's side, his eyes darting between her face and the operating room doors. A sudden clap of thunder shook the building, plunging the hallway into darkness. Sarah froze, clutching Max tighter. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows. "Power's out," a nurse called, her voice strained. "Backup generators will kick in soon." But soon felt like a lifetime. Max squirmed, whining as the darkness pressed in. Sarah's heart raced. She could hear Roxy's faint whimpers through the doors. "Stay calm," she whispered, more to herself than Max. The puppy pawed at her jacket, his nose cold against her neck. Dr. Ellis emerged, her scrubs splattered with blood. "We've stabilized her, but she's not out of danger. The storm's delaying the meds we need. Roads are blocked." Sarah's knees buckled. She slumped against the wall, Max licking her cheek urgently. "How long?" she managed. "Hours, maybe more." The vet's frown deepened. "We're doing all we can." Sarah nodded, numb. Max wriggled free and trotted to the operating room doors, scratching at them. "He needs to see her," Dr. Ellis relented. "But keep him calm." Inside, Roxy lay under a thermal blanket, an IV dripping into her leg. Her eyes were half open, glazed with pain. Max bounded to her side, nudging her face with his nose. Roxy's tail twitched weakly, a silent reassurance. Sarah knelt beside them, her hand resting on Max's back. "You're both fighters," she murmured. But the storm had other plans. A nurse burst in, her face pale. "The generators failed. We're losing heat." Cold seeped into the room like a living thing. Sarah wrapped her arms around Max and Roxy, sharing her body heat. The IV machine beeped erratically. "We need to move her," Dr. Ellis ordered. "Now." Chaos erupted. Nurses scrambled with flashlights, wheeling Roxy's gurney down the pitch-black hall. Max barked, darting ahead as if guiding them. Sarah's breath fogged in the air, her fingers numb. They reached a smaller exam room, lit by battery-powered lamps. "This'll have to do," Dr. Ellis said, adjusting Roxy's IV. "But without power, we can't monitor her properly." Sarah's mind raced. Outside, the wind screamed, rattling the windows. Max pressed against her leg, trembling. She unzipped her coat, draping it over Roxy. "Take mine too," a nurse offered, adding her scrubs jacket. The room grew quieter, the storm's fury muffled by thick walls. Roxy's breathing steadied, but her eyes remained dull. Max climbed onto the gurney, curling beside his mother. Sarah stroked his fur, her own exhaustion threatening to pull her under. "You should rest, Doctor," Ellis urged. Sarah shook her head. "I'll stay." The hours blurred. Max dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Sarah hummed lullabies her mother had sung to her, old tunes she hadn't thought of in decades. Roxy's paw twitched once, brushing Max's side. The puppy nuzzled her, his whimpers softer now. Near dawn, the storm's roar faded. Sarah startled awake, her neck stiff. Max stood at the window, growling low in his throat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the parking lot was buried under 3 feet of white. A tree had split in half, its branches spearing the hospital's roof. And there, beneath the wreckage, Sarah spotted a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between cars. Max's growl intensified. "Probably an animal," Dr. Ellis said, peering out. "Coyotes get desperate in storms." But Sarah's gut tightened. The shadow moved too deliberately, too human. Max barked, hackles raised. "Call the police," Sarah said, her voice steady. The vet hesitated. "Phones are still down, we're cut off." Sarah met Max's anxious gaze. The puppy pawed at the glass, his reflection warped by frost. Beyond the parking lot, the shadow paused, staring back. The shadow lingered at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by the fallen tree. Max's growls turned frantic, his paws scraping the window. Sarah's pulse quickened. "That's no coyote," she muttered, squinting through the frost-glazed glass. The figure shifted, and a glint of metal flashed in the dim light. A knife? Or maybe a crowbar? Dr. Ellis stepped back, her voice trembling. "We need to barricade the doors." Sarah grabbed a nearby chair, wedging it under the handle. Max barked nonstop, his eyes locked on the figure now advancing toward the building. Roxy stirred weakly, her ears twitching at the noise. "Shh, girl," Sarah whispered, pressing a hand to the dog's side. "Stay still." The shadow reached the entrance, and a fist pounded on the glass. "Open up," a man's voice snarled. "I know you've got my dog." Sarah froze. "His dog," Max snarled, teeth bared, as the man slammed his shoulder against the door. The chair creaked under the pressure. Dr. Ellis dialed her phone again, cursing when the call failed. "We're sitting ducks here," she hissed. Sarah's mind raced. The man's claim didn't make sense. Roxy had no collar, no tags, but his desperation was real. She glanced at Max, whose loyalty to Roxy was unwavering. What if he's the reason they were in the woods? The door shuddered. "Give her back," the man roared. Adrenaline surged through Sarah. She'd faced dangerous suspects before, but never unarmed, never with innocent lives at stake. Max lunged at the door, barking ferociously. "No, Max," Sarah grabbed his collar, pulling him back. "Stay with Roxy." The puppy whimpered, but obeyed, retreating to the gurney. Roxy lifted her head, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Her maternal instinct flared despite her weakness. Sarah's throat tightened. They're fighting to protect each other. I can't fail them. Dr. Ellis shoved a scalpel into Sarah's hand. "For defense," she said grimly. The door splintered, the chair snapping in two. The man stumbled in, his face gaunt and wild-eyed. He reeked of alcohol, a hunting knife clutched in his hand. "Where is she?" Max erupted in a frenzy of barks, positioning himself between the man and Roxy. Sarah stepped forward, blocking the gurney. "She's not yours," she said, her voice steady. "Leave, now." The man sneered, waving the knife. "That bitch ran off with my best hunting gear. She's mine." Realization struck Sarah like ice. Roxy hadn't just been injured, she'd been abused. The fractured paw, the infected wounds. This man had used her, then discarded her in the storm. Max's desperate search for help suddenly made horrific sense. "You're not taking her," Sarah said, tightening her grip on the scalpel. The man lunged. Sarah sidestepped, but he grabbed her arm, slamming her into the wall. Pain exploded in her shoulder. Max leaped, sinking his teeth into the man's leg. He howled, kicking the puppy aside. Max hit the floor with a yelp but scrambled up, fur bristling. Roxy let out a guttural snarl, thrashing against her IV lines. The gurney rocked dangerously. "Stop!" Dr. Ellis shouted, throwing a tray of instruments. It clattered at the man's feet, distracting him. Sarah seized the moment, driving her elbow into his ribs. He staggered, and she wrestled the knife from his hand. It clattered to the floor as Max lunged again, snapping at the man's hands. "Get out!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw. The man stumbled back, clutching his bleeding leg. "This isn't over," he spat before limping into the storm. Sarah collapsed against the wall, trembling. Max limped to her side, licking her hand. Dr. Ellis rushed to check Roxy, whose growls subsided into whimpers. "She's okay," the vet breathed. "But we need to move her. He could come back." Sarah nodded, clutching Max to her chest. His small body shook, but his eyes burned with defiance. She pressed her forehead to his. "You're the bravest pup I know," she whispered. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The storm had finally broken, and help was coming. But Sarah's relief was short-lived. The man's threat echoed in her mind. This isn't over. Roxy's IV machine beeped, pulling Sarah back. The dog's eyes met hers, filled with a quiet trust. Max nuzzled Roxy's paw, his tail wagging faintly. In that moment, Sarah vowed silently, "No one will hurt you again." Dr. Ellis placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll report him. Animal control, the police, he'll pay for this." Sarah nodded, but her jaw clenched. Laws were slow, and cruelty often went unpunished. She glanced at Max, now curled protectively against Roxy. "I'll protect them myself if I have to." The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights piercing the dawn. But as paramedics and officers flooded the room, Sarah's focus stayed on the dogs. Max licked Roxy's face, and she nudged him gently. A mother's reassurance. Yet, when Sarah looked out the shattered door, she half expected to see the man's shadow lurking. The storm had passed, but the danger hadn't. The storm outside had finally begun to ease, but inside the dimly lit veterinary hospital, the tension refused to lift. The howling wind had faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the IV monitor beside Roxy's gurney. Sarah sat on the cold linoleum floor, cradling Max in her arms. His tiny body, still trembling from exhaustion and stress, pressed against her chest, his heartbeat a rapid flutter beneath his damp fur. Despite the warmth of the hospital, Sarah could still feel the chill of the night clinging to her bones. The weight of everything that had happened settled heavily on her shoulders. The desperation in Max's eyes when he found her, the harrowing journey through the storm, Roxy's near-lifeless body in the snow, and then the terrifying encounter with the man who had claimed ownership over the injured dog. The thought of him sent a fresh wave of anger through her veins. He was still out there, and if his last words were any indication, this wasn't over. Dr. Ellis moved swiftly around the exam room, checking Roxy's vitals with precise efficiency. Her brow furrowed as she examined the dog's injured paw. The once crimson-stained bandages were now a dull, sickly brown, evidence of the infection fighting against the antibiotics. Roxy let out a weak, pained whimper as the vet adjusted the IV drip. Max immediately perked up, squirming in Sarah's grasp and letting out a high-pitched whine, his ears pressed flat against his head. "She's stable for now," Dr. Ellis murmured, casting a glance toward Sarah. "But the infection is deep, and her body's still weak from the hypothermia. We need to keep her under observation for at least the next 48 hours. Her condition could go either way." Sarah exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. 48 hours. It felt like a lifetime. She knew Max wouldn't leave his mother's side, and neither would she. "I'll stay," Sarah said without hesitation. Dr. Ellis hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "Sarah, I know you care about these dogs, but you've been running on fumes all night. You should go home, get some rest." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I'm not leaving them." She reached down, brushing her fingers over Roxy's cold, damp fur. The dog was still so frail, her breathing shallow but steady. She had been through so much, and yet, despite the pain and exhaustion, there was something in her posture, some quiet strength that reminded Sarah of a soldier who refused to surrender. Max, ever the devoted pup, inched closer to his mother, resting his tiny head on her paw. His tail, though sluggish, gave the faintest wag. Even after all they had endured, he still had hope. Sarah sighed, shifting to make herself more comfortable on the hard floor. "What happens after this?" she asked. "Once she's strong enough?" Dr. Ellis crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "It depends. Legally, if someone claims ownership, it could complicate things." Sarah's jaw tightened. That man doesn't deserve her. He abused her, left her for dead in that storm. Dr. Ellis nodded grimly. "I believe you, but we'll need proof. If he comes back trying to claim her, we might have a fight on our hands." Sarah set her jaw, her fingers absently stroking Max's soft fur. She had dealt with men like that before, entitled, cruel, dangerous, the kind who saw animals as tools, not companions. He had underestimated Max's determination tonight, but she had no doubt he'd try again. A sharp bark pulled her from her thoughts. Max had lifted his head, his ears twitching toward the hospital entrance. His body tensed, his hackles rising slightly. Sarah followed his gaze toward the darkened hallway. The power was still running on backup generators, and the hospital was nearly empty. The storm had shut down most of the roads, which meant no new patients had come in. But there was a strange stillness in the air, a feeling that made Sarah's skin prickle. Then, faintly, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured, moving toward them. Sarah's heart pounded as she gently placed Max down beside Roxy. She stood, reaching instinctively for her belt, only to remember she wasn't on duty. She had no weapon, no radio, just her instincts. Dr. Ellis noticed her sudden shift in posture. "What is it?" she whispered. Sarah didn't answer. She moved toward the exam room door, listening. The footsteps stopped just beyond the waiting area. A shadow flickered against the frosted glass. Max let out a low growl, pressing himself against Roxy's side protectively. Then came the voice. "I know you're in there." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. The man. A sharp bang rattled the entrance door. "I want my dog back." Dr. Ellis inhaled sharply, stepping backward. "Sarah!" "Stay with them," Sarah ordered, voice low. She moved quickly, stepping out of the exam room and into the hallway. The waiting area was dark, the emergency lights barely illuminating the space. Beyond the glass entrance the man stood, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. But she didn't need to see his eyes to know he was seething. "I told you," he spat. "She's mine." Sarah clenched her fists. "You lost that right when you left her to die in the snow." He chuckled darkly. "That's not for you to decide." Another hard slam against the door. Sarah took a step forward, her pulse thundering. "You need to leave. Now." The man sneered. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" Sarah didn't blink. "That's exactly what I'm gonna do." His smirk faltered slightly, but he didn't move. "You think you can keep her?" His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Sarah's spine stiffened. "Neither do you." Behind her, Max barked sharply, a sound too fierce for such a small pup. The man's eyes flickered past Sarah, locking onto the doorway where Max now stood, standing firm in front of Roxy, the dog he had discarded, the dog that had survived him. For the first time, something shifted in the man's expression. Fear. Sarah took a step closer. "You're done," she said quietly. "Stay away from them." He hesitated. Then, with a final glare, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the blizzard. Sarah exhaled shakily, waiting until his silhouette vanished into the snow before stepping back into the exam room. Max was still standing protectively in front of Roxy, his small chest rising and falling quickly, his tail still as stone. Sarah knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "You did good, buddy," she murmured. Max let out a quiet whine, leaning into her touch. Dr. Ellis released a breath. "Think he's gone for good?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked down at Max, then at Roxy. He wasn't gone for good. But she would be ready. Because now they weren't just strays. They were family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible and emotional stories like this one. Max's unwavering loyalty and Roxy's fight for survival remind us of the unbreakable bond between animals and those who choose to protect them. Share this story with your friends and family, because every act of kindness, every rescue, and every second chance can change a life. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story, and remember, true heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they have 4 paws and endless love to give.